Okay, all right. Okay, show of hands. How many are actually here for this session? Okay, that worked. We're running behind here, so I'm just checking. Honestly, yeah. Okay, so today here's what I'm going to cover for you: how to monitor your cluster with effectively with Wavefront. Okay. And first, I'm going to talk a little bit about VKE because we are running all this stuff on VKE. So VKE is VMware's managed Kubernetes service. It's a SaaS-based service. Log in, get some credentials, put your credit card in, and start creating clusters. That's simple. The interesting thing here is that it does run on Amazon. So it will bring up a single tenant in Amazon under our accounts, and you get charged for that. But otherwise, you don't have to pretty much do anything. So it's very simple to use. It's completely Kubernetes conformant, by the way, and there's no interesting VMware stuff in it. There's no PKS or an NSX or any of that stuff. So it's full native Kubernetes all the way through and through. So that's the baseline of what I'm using. So, go ahead to cloud.vmware.com and take a look at it and sign up. I'll stop the marketing spiel for now. Okay, so let's talk about monitoring in Kubernetes. So I want to talk about something called observability, because it's not really about monitoring, but understanding what is happening in your clusters. They're pretty complex, right? You've got everything from baseline resources, infrastructure, whatever that is, vSphere or even Amazon underneath. Then you got your clusters. You got some sort of another overlay networking inside of them, policies, and then you have your application sitting on it in a set of pods, right? To kind of manage this and understand how some of these issues are occurring, it's not simple. This is a hard problem, right? So when you think of that managing, you think of it as a combination of components. You think of it as looking at monitoring of metrics and stats. You look at it as logging, and you look at it as tracing, right? And those are like the three tenets in Kubernetes for observability, as we like to call it, right? And that confluence of components there actually helps you understand and solve problems. Okay, so monitoring alone is not going to help you do it. Now, how you solve that, you have various different ways of getting to that solution. It has a vast ecosystem, right? I mean, you can pull in anything that you find that you think may be interesting to utilize. Now, generally, what most people do, and this is the most common approach for observability, you load up your sidecars inside of your clusters or your agents, right? I'll load up maybe a Zipkin or FluentD, not necessarily a sidecar, but like FluentD is a daemon set. Load those up. Same thing with Prometheus. Load up Prometheus itself. You may have some injections of sidecars in there. It'll gather information from singular clusters and send that off someplace else where you're aggregating it. And that's the problem, right? It's really not the cluster information, but the aggregation, which is a big problem. So developers can go in and actually put all this tooling in, but you may not see it as an admin. Now, how do you solve this? Okay, so the common approach, again, use Prometheus on top, but it's not simple to use. You do have to play with it quite a bit and create, and then you use Grafana with some pre-created JSON graphs, and you can find some on the web. And then logging will go to Elasticsearch. Wonderful. Okay, so at VMware, we have a couple of products that we've released that actually help you solve some of that very simply and easily from an aggregation perspective with not a lot of tinkering to do. Elasticsearch, you got to tinker with. Prometheus and Grafana, you have to tinker with for the aggregation support and have all your dashboards. This is kind of out of the box. But to get that information up to Wavefront or let's say a log intelligence, you still have to go and load up the standard Kubernetes components underneath, like a FluentD or a Prometheus, et cetera. And that's effectively what I'm going to show you today, is loading that up and looking at Wavefront for the monitoring aspect of observability. Okay? So I've got an application that I installed on a cluster. It's a simple application. It's a website with an API server. It also has a MySQL service in it. And it gets front-ended by the VKE Ingress controller, which is an Nginx controller, which is a load balancer. That comes with VKE as soon as you start a cluster. And what I'm going to show you today is I'm going to focus on specifically one cluster, right, of one pod, one service called my Flask API service. I'm going to show you how you can load up a Telegraph, build a Telegraph sidecar, and load it up into that pod, and then have that sidecar send information to Wavefront, and you'll see a dashboard on Wavefront. So let's talk a little bit about Wavefront first, and how Wavefront supports Kubernetes clusters. It's fairly simple, right? And the concept is it has a couple of components that you have to install. You just go to your Wavefront dashboard, look for a integration, and it actually gives you the YAMLs, okay? You just copy and paste. That simple. We all know how to copy and paste, right? Okay. So main thing, you load up a proxy deployment. That proxy deployment is the main heart and soul of that Wavefront collector, right? You create a service, and then you load, and that actually is the funnel, everything, and that goes to Wavefront. Now, I'm going to show you how to do it from the actual application containers, but you can also load something else called the Heapster or version, Wavefront's Heapster deployment, and that actually goes and sits on the cluster and pulls node and port and cluster information, so you can actually see that too, not just the application information. Okay? So that's the first step. Next one is you have to go in and actually modify your applications to output statistics for monitoring to work. Okay? Now, most people think of monitoring, hey, I've loaded Kubernetes up and I've got Prometheus running and I can see all of my node stats and cluster stats. That's not it enough, because you want to know how well that application is potentially running. Your developer is probably going to do something about that, right? So at an admin level, you're probably okay. But you're going to want to add libraries. So as an example, Flask is a Python-based application, and I loaded a standard statsd library that I found on the web someplace. And what statsd is that it actually takes information inside of, you have to load it in the code, you import the library, you add calls in specific areas, and what it does is take stats like how many times was this API called, how long did it take for the API to be called, and outputs them to a port 8125. And that's just, it's going out, right? And that's the most important piece for application stats, okay? Now, how do I get this in, let's say, into Wavefront? Well, first, okay, the application is now outputting it. You have to create a collector inside of the actual pod itself, and you have to install a sidecar. But before you do that, you got to create a sidecar. So you have to create a Docker container that actually has the right information to pull from that application. And here's a telegraph.conf file, and Telegraph is what we are going to use as a sidecar to pull that information out from 8125 on that application. You can look up Telegraph. It's an open source tool that's out there. And so what we do here is that we effectively create a Docker container with a specific config file, and we add variables into it. First main thing that you have to add is where you're sending the information, right? I'm going to send it to my Wavefront location, right? And inside of the inside of the Docker, inside of the conf file is where you put those environment variables for it to use, right? And we're going to pass that information actually from the Kubernetes file. So once you've created this container, it's going to have these env files that it is going to look for as pass-throughs from Kubernetes, okay? And there's a few in here. I haven't gone through all of them. Intervals one, Wavefront proxies another. Standard Docker build, put it in your favorite location, repository, wherever you want, right? Once you've created it. I've got one. If you go to my Git repo, you'll find one for statsd. It's pretty simple. Next thing, you've got to add the Telegraph sidecar config now into your YAML for your deployment file, okay? So this is just one piece of the entire deployment, right? There's another component in here that loads up in the YAML that actually loads up the API server that is pulling stats from. But this section is the sidecar. Now you notice where it's pulling it from. It's pulling it from Google, that is my image. It's open. You guys can pull it and use it, right? It looks for port 8125. And then I give it a value here called Wavefront proxy for that variable. And obviously, if you know Kubernetes, and it's just going to DNS resolve Wavefront proxy to wherever that service is located in my cluster. Give it the interval, still on 60 seconds. And then I do something interesting here. I say node hostname, pull that information from Kubernetes, right? Because as I pull information out of that cluster, specifically where that pod is located, I want to know where it's coming from, right? And that is going to actually expose out this pod is running on this cluster. I can expose a lot more information. I can expose pod, I can expose a whole bunch of other things. I've just decided to expose this. Put that inside of your deployment, and specifically I've added this into something called API server deployment. And you run that, deploys your server. You don't have to touch the service, right? Deployment, just the deployment side. Once that's done, you should have this sort of a configuration running inside your pod, which is an API server, in my case, or whatever application you're running, spitting out information on port 8125, and then that sidecar, Telegraph, pulling that information out and sending it directly to Wavefront on a regular interval. And that's it. Okay? Now, what do I get with this? Okay? So let's do a little show and tell. Okay, so let me just show you a couple of files first and show you what this looks like. This place does not like me here. Okay. Okay, so let's take a look at this deployment here. Look at my pods. There's my pods. This is on my default namespace, by the way, right? I've got a bunch of stuff in here. You can see a Cloud Health connector. You'll see Jaeger, Grafana, that's all running. There's the Wavefront proxy right there, okay? And all of these services are talking to that Wavefront proxy to the sidecar. So let's look at one of these pods. Okay, so what's inside that pod? Well, there's my container, the API server, and there's my statsd collector, Telegraph. And it is looking at these ports. I've turned them all on, but I'm only utilizing port 8125. Now, in addition to this, I'm just going to show you something else in this cluster. You'll notice that in addition to the default where I have a lot of my stuff running, there's also this thing called Heapster. Now that component actually pulls the information about cluster and pods and all that. It's the baseline information for just standard Kubernetes monitoring, right? It's going to be replaced by metric server and some other stuff, so just keep watching it, so this will change. But for right now, this is how it works. So now that it's up, right, and my proxy's running, right? Let's go to Wavefront. So first thing to notice is that, let's go to this thing called, I'll show you one last thing before I do this, right? So I'm going to just describe this pod for a second, and then we'll show you what it looks like. Okay, inside of the proxy, right? Actually, sorry, wrong one. Let me just show you something here. So it's a Heapster file. The Heapster file actually has a name of the actual cluster, so I gave it a name, right? Okay, so inside of here, if you look at, and it's a sink, right? So in the configuration of Heapster, I gave it a name, and that name was VCS Demo Cluster, right? So that's my identifier from Heapster about this entire cluster where everything's running, okay? Now that identifier gets used, so as soon as Heapster comes up and the proxy's up, it starts spitting information out. And as soon as that comes up, it starts sending it to Kubernetes. It starts sending to Wavefront, and Wavefront has a standard Kubernetes dashboard, right? So my cluster information is now showing up here, right? Pretty cool. It's got namespaces, right? The nodes are here, okay? I can see all the node information, the namespaces. I can even go down and see here's all the pods that are running. Give it a second to reload, right? There's the pods, right? There's Prometheus. There's that Wavefront proxy, et cetera, et cetera. Pretty cool? Okay. And so this will give you a ton of information just about the cluster. So now let's take a look at the actual application bits itself. So Kubernetes has, and the way you find this is fairly simple, right? On VKE, you just go, let's just get the nodes. And you'll see a worker and a master node. So all I did was search for the worker node because that's where my deployment is. And I look for metrics. So if I take a look at everything that's coming from that node, there's about 200 plus metrics that are being pulled from that actual worker node. Now, I know that that application is spitting out something called fit cycle, and it's got 8 metrics. The first one is something called prospect pull, right? And all that's doing is saying how many times was that API hit. And there it is, right? And I can scroll over this, and it actually gives me detailed information about each one of those API pods that it's pulling information from, because each one of them has a telegraph sidecar injected inside of it, okay? Now, I can also see times, right? Mean time to pull on all 3 of them, okay? Etc. Now, I have other stuff that I've loaded up here. So I also have MySQL, okay? So that's the MySQL service. I've loaded that up. And I can do some interesting things here. I can take a look at InnoDB. And let's take a look at, oh, I don't know, let's pick something here. How many times was InnoDB read? Let's go down there, okay. Whatever, it's just a flat line, but you get the picture here, right? So not only can you instrument the entire cluster statistics, right, on Wavefront, but with those sidecar injections inside your application and your deployments, you can get everything you need out of that application component. Now, in Wavefront, there are tons of integrations. And this is all great for, specifically for, let's say, virtual machines, wherever you run that. For Kubernetes, you have to use those sidecars that I told you about. So I used specifically statsd for my 2 application servers, and then I use MySQL for the MySQL piece of my application to get all that stats out. And that's it. Questions? Yeah.
What database is Wavefront running under the hood?
It's a combination of a few. It's proprietary slash. I mean, they've made it so it scales. I mean, you know, some of the customers it's handling somewhere on, I don't know how many millions of points per second per customer. A couple of them, you know, we've got like 800 developers on it. And it'll store information right now. I wouldn't say an infinity, but I can look at data going back like a year, and it looks like it happened today. It's a time series database, yeah. It's I've asked this question internally, and engineers also trust me. And there's actually a bunch of stuff in there that it's built. Yeah. Anything else? Huh? Go ahead.
So you have done performance benchmarking then for
so do we have to performance benchmark it against other? You could. I don't. They might have performance benchmarks. I don't think they've performance benchmarked against something. But I think that the point here is that it's this simple, right? So look, I mean, I can come up and I can bring up Prometheus for you on that cluster. But Prometheus is also very hard to use in the sense that you got to know what you're looking for. Then you got to connect it up to Grafana, and you have to get the right chart to showcase it, right? And if that's not working, then you have to go in and mech with the JSONs to get the right tools. Honestly, just hook up that sidecar, inject it, it's done. It's really nice, honestly, yeah. Okay?